Welcome everyone to our debate. This is Corner's debate organized by the Euranet Plus agency and the Polish Radio. I would like to welcome our guest in the studio, Mr. Andris Goerens, the president of the European Movement, the father of the European Year for Development. That is why I introduce you as the first one, because we will talk today about the European Year for Development. I would like to also welcome Madame Beata Płomecka from the European Commission, the leader team dealing with the development aid. I would like to also welcome Mr. Seamus Jefferson. Hello, Director of the European Confederation for Relief and Development. I would like to also welcome Mr. Charles Goerens, the member of the European Parliament from Luxembourg, from the group of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats, and Mr. Victor Negrescu, also the member of the European Parliament from Romania, the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. I would like to also welcome a student in our studio, Irene Benedicto. She has just got her grade in journalism of the Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona. I hope the pronunciation was proper. She works for the Spanish press agency, but she will move in November to Buenos Aires. So I would like to also inform you that we are in the internet, in Twitter, in Facebook. In internet, you can listen and watch us on the Euranet Plus -inside.eu. And also you can check what's going on Facebook and Twitter. And as I mentioned Facebook and Twitter, I would like to start with the first question, because I sometimes think that we are in this Brussels bubble. We know what's going on. We know what is development cooperation, development aid. But the first question was from Isa. She wrote it on Facebook. What is this European development, European aid? And the first question I would like to put to Andris Goerens, the father of the European Year of Development.
Development cooperation is a joint effort to make the world better. That's the simple way how to explain it. If we see people crossing the Mediterranean, for example, they don't do it for fun or for adrenaline. They do it because of extreme poverty, because of war, because of other things. If we want to make the world better, if we don't want to see people dying in the Mediterranean, if we want to be fair as well for those people to have a fair and good salary in their home countries or here on the spot, we can do quite a lot in this respect. As smart consumers, for example, or looking, for example, in the Commission's initiative to have fair labeling for clothes, which might be one of the outcomes of the European year. So for those people who say we don't want to have kids working for producing clothes, I pay €2 more for a clothes, but I know there is no kid involved and there is a fair pay for the employee in Bangladesh or elsewhere for producing this thing. So we can jointly, as individuals, as member states and as EU altogether, make the world better. And it is about cooperation, not only donation. And I think this is as well, I think the Civil Society Alliance has raised a very good slogan, which is, it's not about how much we give, but how we live. This means this responsible consuming, responsible decision making, not giving with one hand and taking money out of the developing world with the other, which means a fair taxing system, for example. So it's our companies who work in the development work. They don't take the profits only out, but they reinvest that. There is some kind of motivation from ourselves to reinvest in those countries, really to make the world better. The world as I think we all deserve it.
To make world better, I would like to ask Beata Płomecka, we know that in the times of the austerity measures, in the time of crisis, is it possible to cope with all these goals with 15 billion euros, as we know last year, that was given by the European Union to cope with these huge challenges, fight with the poverty?
Yeah, thank you. I think first of all, European citizens, and we have seen this over a long period. I'm just citing the EU barometer, which was published at the beginning of the year. We still have very high numbers on how Europeans support EU development cooperation, meaning that 85% thinks that we should help poor people in partner countries. Another group says like 67% are in favor of the fact that order should be increased. So this is one side. So I think we can count on a really solid basis of our over a long time period that we have the support within Europe. This is one thing. I can understand the point as well. In terms of austerity, it's extremely difficult to get the support from the Europeans in general. But we are not talking only about money here, I think. And this really comes very clear, like if you look towards Addis right now, what's going on in Addis is not only about order. I think we have to look into other points like enabling policy environments, like mobilizing domestic resources, like trade issues. So order is only one point. This is very important to mention. I'd like to underline what you just said, Andres, as well. It's not about how much we give. This is really as well how we live. And we do this in partnership together with other countries worldwide. And that's what we are looking towards New York as well. So this will be a new framework post-2015 together with all countries around the world. It's not only an issue from industrialized countries. I think it's very important to underline. Last point I'd like to make here, of course, we find it very challenging to communicate on development cooperation during this period, but we try to focus on the young people. So really the young people looking into the future, making clear as well with a new narrative on development that it's something of mutual interest, global dimension. We are not only telling people how much we spend. So we talk about results, we are making the point, this is in your very best interest as well. What we are doing here, we're searching for your support.
Using an opportunity that we have also to members of the European Parliament dealing with financing and budget, how come the European Union and the European Parliament can guarantee that the money used are well spent? Because all we know when we read all these news from the third world, that the money is wasted. There are some people working like windmill workers that are getting money. How can you guarantee that the money will be well spent?
Well, you can never guarantee that all the money spent is spent in the right way. Even within the European community or in our member states, it can be the case that money is not spent in the right way. That's not the reason to say we stop this policy. Now, first of all, one must add to the 15 billion given for the spent in terms of official development assistance, you must add to these 15 billion 40 billion coming from the member states, and that together gives you a huge amount, enabling you to act in a way to overcome problems, poverty, access to pharmaceuticals, and so on. Well, the best way to do this in order to spend money in the most appropriate way is to base your policy on partnership. You must act in a way that our partners can ensure over a longer period the ownership of the projects and programs devoted to them. Second, you must have in your demarche an evaluation, midterm reviews at the end of the implementation of a program, in order to ensure that in the longer future, development is a part of the activities of the partner country. You cannot develop people. People must develop themselves. And it is our duty to make development possible by providing technical assistance, by providing lessons learned from our own development. Let's take, for instance, development of the regional policy in Africa. They can learn a lot from us. We have an experience and expertise to share with them. And that's exchanging methods, better working with best practices, and so on. We can also learn a lot from them.
Mr. Victor Negrescu?
I will introduce a different concept. I will speak more about fair cooperation or fair partnership, because I believe the word fair is very important when we refer to developing countries. What I believe and what I'm supporting and sustaining in my committee, in the Budgets Committee, is that we really need to have the money to support the development cooperation policies that we have at the level of the EU. We have a lot of good intentions, but not so many results. And I'm speaking not only as an MEP, I'm also speaking as a teacher that teaches about development cooperation. I believe we have to do more and be more pragmatic and more efficient in what we develop as project, but also we need to reinforce cooperation between member states. We have sometimes member states financing the same things, the same type of projects, but not working together, and this reduces the efficiency of the impact that the EU can have really on the lives of the people in developing countries. Because I would like to refer more, when we talk about development cooperation, to refer to people more than to states, more than to authorities, but more to people and making their lives better, because development means improving the living conditions and the life of the people that we want to save, basically. And of course, something that is very important, I believe my colleague mentioned, ownership. It's very important to help the recipient countries and the recipient citizens to develop their own project afterwards and really have a continuity of the financing that they receive. And this is something that we need to reinforce, and this is something that we need to do at the level of the EU, because again, I'm more supporting the idea of development cooperation than simply aid, but the concept or the part of aid is also very, very important. And sometimes what I see as a practitioner also, because before becoming an MEP, I went on the ground on different development cooperation projects, and what I see is that some projects are developed more for the donor country than for the recipient country. And we have to change this perspective. It is clear here that at the level of the European Commission, it is a good perspective. It's a perspective that is improving every year. But we have to improve the way the EU member states act as well, and push them towards this type of policies, and also make them contribute, because we are talking about the European Year for Development, to really respect what they promised. It's a percentage that they have to give for development cooperation. It's not only about the amount, it's about how this amount can really help the development of the entire world and improving the living condition of the people that we want to help.
Thank you very much for these ideas. I would like to also refer to Sven, who wrote on the Facebook he couldn't grasp the whole figures. Is it 15? Is it 40? As you've mentioned, concerning member states. So thank you very much. Using an opportunity that we have Irene here, Irene would like to ask you also the question.
Yes, with that idea of the that we all agree in that development is necessary, and it's current with Europe values like solidarity or cooperation, but there's also needed for numbers for many people to believe in that. So, for example, is there any research or paper published that provides evidences of how to invest in development benefits the EU society? Is my question for Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Copping.
Thanks, Irene. I mean, I think my answer to that question would be that what's extremely important, and I think part of what this European year is about, is ensuring that there is backing from the general public for the decisions that politicians need to make on development cooperation. And that's about budget, and that's about EU policies as well. So I think that the exercise of awareness about what is going on in other parts of the world, looking at responsibilities of Europe for poverty and for disadvantage in other parts of the world are an important part of a discussion and a dialogue that we need to have with the European public. And I think that's what part of the European year is about. Dorte also spoke about a new narrative. We've had historically a narrative about development which has been about charity, and I think that 30 years on from famine in the Horn of Africa, I think that narrative has now changed and is changing, and I think that some of the previous speakers have made reference to that. I'm very struck by what Victor said about fairness. I think this is a concept that people can grasp. I think the concept that we see in the Sustainable Development Goals about universality, about some of the challenges that we are facing in Europe, about resources and fair use of resources, about transparent tax policies that benefit not only wealthy people but also vulnerable people, climate change. These are topics that face everyone in the world. And I think that in our conversation with the public about our external policies, I think that concept about what affects other people in the world also affects us, I think that needs to come out.
Mr. Goerens.
I would say, well, first on results, because that was a little bit the question from the previous speakers. There are incredible results in when we look into the Millennium Development Goals, which were the commonly set goals in 2000 when we said, okay, how do we want to live in future? Look at extreme poverty, it has decreased. Child mortality, mother mortality. Imagine your child dying, but this is a situation because of dirty water or other things. Imagine you being in this situation. We have managed with joint efforts to decrease these numbers. Still not enough, but we're on a good way, and that's where we see as well these state funding, EU funding is crucial and very important to continue this track and not to get off track. When we talk with people, I absolutely agree with those people saying, actually, people don't, in developing world, they don't say, we want to have money, we want to have donation, we want to have humanitarian aid. They say, we want to be treated fairly. We want to have the same chance to sell our goods, not to be in the market, so our market is not destroyed by farming subsidies, for example, from the EU. We are subsidizing our farmers. We used to have at some time even export subsidies, which were destroying the markets in the developing world. So on the one hand side, we, through our intense subsidies, just as one of the examples, we were destroying the markets. On the other side, then we see the damage which we have caused, and then we send some donations. That's not the way people want to be dealt with. They say, and this is where we can learn quite a lot, when we listen really carefully to these people, they say, we want to be dealt fairly, which means fair access, no subsidies, no harm done by EU policies. And that's where we have to do quite a lot of homework and where we have a chance during this year to focus at.
Irene, also, Mr. Bosse would like to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to get back to your original question, actually, which I find extremely useful, because we at the point over the preparation of the European Year for Development, we always try to put ourselves in the shoes of a young European, which is our main target group of the European Year for Development, and to focus on what is in there for me. You know, as a young European, does this year possibly give me a chance to know more about development or even employment? You know, with all the employment rates, the unemployment rates throughout Europe, I think it's a very valid point. So we try to focus this on these young people to explain what could be win-win options for them as well. You were mentioning the different themes, like I think you as well, agriculture, climate change. I think we have to be very specific, very concrete to explain what is in there for me as a young European, you know? Is there something I could be interested in which would be interesting for me? Talking about as well knowledge sharing, migration. What are the positive effects for Europe? I think it's extremely environment as well, climate change. I think it's extremely important to discuss this, to bring this to the table, but it's even more challenging to explain this. It's already quite challenging to explain what is EU development cooperation. To come with a full package, what we call policy coherence for development, is even more challenging to put it in normal words so that normal young Europeans can understand this, you know, that we can meet there somehow. Thank you.
Irene, you also have a second question to our guests.
I found especially interesting when you focus on migrations, because I come from Spain. We are affected by that phenomenon. And for example, Mr. Goerens said before, how, for example, improving the standards of living in a country of Africa can dissuade people from migration. Does that relation exist?
No.
We have numbers, research, evidences of that?
Well, I think it's important to understand we don't do development cooperation because we want to prevent someone from migration. That's not the reason. We want to have really a better world people not dying because they don't have clean drinking water which they can drink, etc. Of course, it can have an indirect effect as well on migration. Why I use this migration issue, because that's one of the issues which is in everyday's media, which is, I think, everyone listening and following this debate very much knows. And there you see the tragedy of poverty. Imagine if you would be a person who would if you would risk your life coming across the Mediterranean, where you have perhaps a 50% of survival chance. It means that the danger back at home, the poverty and all the system there is even worse. So I think, well, this is the last ringing bell to say, okay, we have to do more, but of course not only in those countries where we have now, well, Syria is war situation, in other countries, but it's about the entire world, because there is child dying and people without education in a lot of countries, partly because of our policies, of our wrongdoing here in the EU. So that's where we can and should work with. And perhaps one more aspect which we have been discussing in the Economic and Social Committee, where I have the honor as well to be a representative from Latvia's side and to represent civil society in this entire debate about development cooperation. And perhaps as well linked to the idea of the European year. 4 years ago, when everything started with my call to my colleague in Latvia, I said we have had so much experience with wrong type of help, this kind of donor-driven. So I give you the money, but I spend all the money for my own salary and for my flight costs to come to Latvia. We had all kinds of experts coming to Latvia trying to teach us how to do things better. That was actually in lots of situations even stealing our times and doing harm in Latvia. Perhaps 10% of this type donor-driven policies were really effective. Those were really effective, and thanks really for these things as well. But we have to change this, what Seamus mentioned. We have to change our mindset really, and I think most people have changed already, from donating to really cooperating and to understand, and through the listening exercise to understand what are the things which we should change in our lives, not to increase the harm.
Mr. Negrescu would like to add something.
I come from a former recipient country. You know, Romania, Eastern European countries were recipient countries of development cooperation or development aid, and it is proven that it's a success story, because Eastern European countries, a lot of them managed to develop and achieve what they achieved through this type of help, either through technical help, either through different types of funds. It was a good start. Now our countries have become donor countries, and from what we learned, we now try to learn how to help others as well and develop cooperation. I'm mentioning that because a lot of time when we refer to development cooperation, we talking about effects, how we can fight against migration or things like that. I'm personally against this type of perspective. We really have to be careful when we use this type of words, because the idea of development cooperation is really to try to contribute to the development of the entire world. And again, referring to what my colleague mentioned earlier, saving lives. I want to use this perspective because this is a true perspective. Every money that is spent is not a figure. It's people saved, and this is something that we need to reinforce. And there is a concept that we need to use more. The idea of development education is something that is really important at the European Union level. We need to teach European citizens how development cooperation can be helpful, what development brings, what our activities are doing, because more and more extremists, sometimes politicians, but not only politicians, use development cooperation as something that is bad and blame it for what is going on and say that we shouldn't participate in what is going on at the world level. No, the European Union has been built on solidarity, and participating at the development of the entire world is our objective. It's what defines us and what we should do.
Mr. Goerens has different view.
I think it's important. I didn't try to say that it is doing bad. That was not the main message. I said there is quite a lot of work which is done good. But if we would spend those 90%, which used to be very donor-driven, at least in my country, when there were international experts coming in Latvia as development cooperation help for Latvia, which was not very useful. If they would have listened much more carefully to the real needs back in Latvia, I think we would have a better developed Latvia nowadays with better invested 90%. 10% were perfect. 90%, let's look that this money is really invested. well, smartly, fairly. And this is where we have to listen to the needs in the developing world, not to pretend as if we would be the ones knowing the best recipes. We don't know them. We have to learn ourselves.
Mr. Goerens would like to add something.
I would like to add something to that. One must say that the European development policy is based on the principle of untied aid. That means that project must be result-oriented. And that's the fact in reality. And there are assessments made by the OECD every year or every 2 years for the Commission as well as for the Member States. And there we see whether or not aid is tied or untied. Furthermore, the European Union is increasing budgetary aid. That means that official development assistance is no longer channeled through projects or programs, but comes directly to the treasury of the recipient country. And they have to define their own priorities together in dialogue with their parliament and their civil society. That's the way to proceed. And we are moving in this direction.
We're on a very good track, actually. I think that the situation I was describing, that was the situation 15, 20 years ago. I think now we're on a very good track but still we have some failures, of course.
Personally, I'm not for this type of budgetary help because, again, we should help people, not governments. Governments sometimes have different type of interest, and you refer to administration cost. Yeah, unfortunately, we see programs and projects developed by EU member states that use 20%, 30% of the money that should go to the recipient people, used for traveling, for administrative costs. We should improve the efficiency of this type of programs as well.
But that's the only manner to let in the future the colonial spirit behind us. Huh? You must allow the recipient countries the possibility to define themselves their priorities.
With
and
the civil
budgetary
society.
aid is linked to several conditions. If money is spent in the wrong way, then the European Commission or the member states can stop this kind of aid.
Libya was a recipient country at a certain moment, and other countries that have governments that were owned by dictatorship. Though I believe the idea of helping civil society is the best way.
All of you mentioned colonial past. I mean, yeah, what we see now, the voices coming from the countries that are helped, is you are treating us like a protectorate. How can we get use of this bad face of the EU helping, but at the same time imposing something? Mr. Seamus.
Yes, maybe Beata, I can take that on. I mean, just to take the conversation forward, I think it's absolutely right, as Charles Goerens says, that we support the plan of that country and that we do not seek to impose another plan. I think it's fairly depressing that we're seeing that within Europe, but at the moment, but that's another debate. But certainly, this is something we've learnt in all the years of development cooperation, that we have to support the initiative of the country we're trying to support. The point I wanted to make is about the role of civil society in that, and that is that and it links a little bit to the last question, which was not only must we involve the general public in Europe in debates about our development policy, which is what the European Year on Development is all about, but also in the partner countries. I think if those people supposed to be benefiting from health programs are not consulted about the health infrastructure that's being put up in their name, then that's not going to be successful. If they don't have a channel to criticise or to say their point of view about whether those health services being put up in their name are really benefiting their community, then I think we've got a problem. And so it's not only about the quantity of aid, it's also about the quality. And that's something, again, we've been working on for many years, a development effectiveness, what we call a development effectiveness agenda. And part of that is effective participation of the people that are, for whom these projects are being done.
We have a second student from Poland, Justyna Tylczyńska, student from Warsaw, and she's also got a question for our participants.
Good morning. How development aid influences relation between countries? I mean, does European Union treat countries as equal partners or only as beneficiaries?
Mr. Goerens.
Yes, I didn't understand the last word. As
beneficiaries.
Beneficiaries.
Partner or beneficiary?
We do consider them as a partner. And we have to develop strategies together with them that starts with a political dialogue, Have we the same view on on their country? And then we can say, well, where are your priorities? That's the reason why they are invited to develop their own development strategies. And then later on, discussions go further on items like the currency, the political, general political conjuncture, and so on, access to market. How do those countries intend to integrate themselves in the world economy? That is part of the discussion. And then it's always up to them, after an exchange of views with the donor so-called donor countries, I prefer the word partner, then it's up to them to definitely fix themselves on their priorities.
Donors.
It's up to them, not once again, it's not up to us to develop them, it's up to them to develop themselves.
Donors or partners, Mr. Negrescu.
Just 10 seconds. I believe we treat them as beneficiary, and we should treat them as partners. So let's see that we are planning to treat them as a partner, and we are still in a process of really considering the developing countries as partner and equal partner countries, and this is what we are supporting, some of us at least.
Dorothy Besser, one word from you.
Yeah, perhaps just the technical point of view of what was already mentioned. So we really take this extremely seriously to align our policies, actually part of the aid effectiveness agenda, with the policies of our partner countries. So when we design the actual set of financial instruments, we call them financial instruments, the programs, how we work, the funds, how we work with partner countries, this is enshrined in there that our starting point is, wherever possible, the national development plan of each partner country. So normally if there's one, we start from their policies. Extremely important to align to their policies, to have their ownership, because they need to develop themselves. So.
Mr. Goerens.
I think this is a good point. I think it's important as well, and that's a point where we should ask for as well for those so-called recipient countries then, is to involve really civil society, to have real ownership, not only from the government, but to work and to develop this development plan together with the society. And that was the aspect which my colleague mentioned before, is how much do we work state-driven policies, how much do we have people-driven or people-targeted policies. We know that there is a lot of extreme poverty as well in middle-income countries, so-called middle-income countries, where the overall GDP would be quite well, but still there is extreme poverty. We see even big poverty in our EU countries, in some of the member states, where again, with the new development goals, sustainable development goals, we will have to focus more as well on perhaps the poverties here on the pot, and to develop structures, systems, how to make our own societies more fair, because I don't think we want to. I think we want as well that it's the farmer, the small biological farmer, getting the funds, and not the big trading company which is shipping the milk all around the world. So if we can buy directly from the farmer, or develop some different systems which makes my money go to the place where I want it to go, then I think we are on the safe side. And that's we in the micro level, with where I can decide where my money goes to. I can do it as well as an organization. If I want to be more committed, more involved, I join an organization on environment issues, on development issues, or something else. Or I write a letter to my policy maker, decision maker, to support a more fair world. That's what I can do.
There is one more question I would like to ask. The actions by the governments is one thing, but the support from the public opinion is the other. Sometimes the actions the governments are doing as the public support, as the public opinion can help them. What we see is, maybe I'm wrong, I wonder what is your opinion. In the European Union, the Westerners are more willing to help, like the countries in the eastern part have not that tradition. I have on my right people from the Western Europe, on my left side the eastern part. Do you agree that the tradition is divided European Union as far as the development help is concerned?
In a certain sense, yes, because the eastern part of the European continent is closer to people living in the Caucasus and in the eastern part of the world. That's very natural. I come from a state which had no colonial past. That's the reason why I can appreciate what is right and what is wrong. Several other countries. Spain is more orientated to Central and Southern America. France has a colonial past in Africa. There are closer links, that's evident. But that's no reason to refuse a common orientation, common priorities, and enabling the European Union to act as one entity. And what has been achieved so far goes in the right direction. In my view, this policy is better than the reputation several media made from it.
Seamus Jefferson, if I may ask you.
Well, I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think one shouldn't generalise. I think that's the first thing. I think we're now 11 years on from the big enlargement. I mean, I think it's now useful to talk about use other labels to group different countries. And I think sort of new member states or EU13 doesn't necessarily help us. I think, as Charles Goerens says, of course there is a different history, but again, that's also very nuanced. One of the things that has combined with the European Year is the Richard Kapuscinski lectures, and that reminds us of this very inspiring and inquisitive Polish journalist with a very unique experience and perspective in Africa, and I think he's a very European voice. So I think we need to respect that nuances, understanding we all come from different perspectives, and I think what Andres and Victor said about their experience, if you like, receiving support from the EU, that's also a very, that's a very useful part of Europe's rich tapestry that we have to share with our partners. I think all the civil society role in the transformations in Eastern Europe, that is something that we haven't had in Western Europe, and something that we, that different bits of Europe bring to our common story.
Mr. Goerens didn't agree with me.
I don't agree, and I think it's deeply symbolic that the idea was born in Latvia, which is one of the northeastern European countries,
That's
which is
right.
definitely not one of the richest. I think we are third poorest, so to say, when looking on the GDP in EU. When looking on nature, we're one of the richest, or singing culture, or other things. But if looking on financial issues, we're one of the poorest. The idea grew in Latvia and was born in Latvia. So I think we are worse in ODA, the aid donation part, so giving money as donor to someone receiving it. I think in some aspects we might be even better when talking about cooperation part, and that's, I think, also in the terminology it has changed from development aid to development cooperation. It's not only a word change which has happened, it's the change of the mindset. And when talking about cooperation, there is nothing more natural for a Latvian to cooperate with colleagues in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia, Moldova, which are also developing countries, and where as well the transition experience which we have made from authoritarian, totalitarian regime into a democracy with participation possibilities for civil society, where this experience is extremely needed, and where we perhaps better hear the real needs of those people which are said to us. So I think this real cooperation, we don't brand it as development cooperation. So if you look into the tables, we're the complete losers, if I might say, and use this harsh word in terms of funding. But I think it's as well partly because we don't brand those things as development cooperation, because they're so normal for us.
Mr.
Just to
Negrescu?
cooperate, to exchange. It's simply normal for us.
I completely agree with my colleague. It's a different focus. Of course, we focus more on the countries that are in our region, that we know better, and where we can really use our expertise. But what we have to understand is that we didn't have a development cooperation expertise in our country. So we are developing experts, learning people. Just for instance, in my country, in Romania, we have now 4 MA programs on development cooperation. So we are improving, we are learning. We are learning how to do official development cooperation as well, something that we didn't know before. It's an ongoing process. It's clear that we have a lot of Eastern Europeans involved in different institutions or NGOs across Europe in development cooperation. We don't have our own strong institutions or NGOs. We will need to develop them in the future. This is why maybe we aren't so visible, but I really see a true future engagement of Eastern Europeans in development cooperation.
Thank you very much. I think this is such a broader picture that we should organize another debate, another 45 minutes. As we are running out of time, please, I will ask each of you to sum up the goals and the risks. Maybe we will start with the father of the European Year of Development.
The goals is to not only to talk talk, but to have real commitments, which are not only words, nice words and promises, but which we really keep. If jointly we increase the motivation of our decision makers, now these days in Addis, later in New York or in Paris, then we're on a safe side. But the civil society support is needed.
Mr. Seamus Jefferson?
I mean, I think the opportunity is, and as Dorota says, to look at new communities. I think of young people, I'm thinking about diaspora communities in Europe, just to name two. New communities that haven't, in Europe, that maybe aren't as engaged in these questions as we all are, and as the organisations we work with. So I think that's the great opportunity of this year. I think the risk is that we enter a debate in which other voices come in and try to look inwards and look in a rather small-minded way about problems within Europe and not to see our place in the world. But I think that is a risk we need to take. We need to be bold, we need to talk about the possibilities and not be put off by those sort of voices.
Dorota Bessa?
Yeah, keep it short. The goals are really to inform people better. There are a lot of people who don't know about EU development cooperation. And secondly, really get more people involved. There are already a lot of people, but we want to have more. And then the third goal is really of the European year to tell really this new narrative, which is the most challenging, really global outreach, mutual interest of what we are doing. The risks for me are really that we go beyond the converted, what we always say in development cooperation, we really want to reach out to the normal people in the street. Therefore, I'd like to underline this year again, we have a special website on the European Year for Development where you find wonderful tools how to promote the European Year for Development. So wherever you go in a search machine, you type on European Year for Development 2015, you get right through our website, and this is extremely important. We have great educational toolkits, normal toolkit, visual identity. It's all out there in all languages of all member states. So very close to the citizen.
Mr. Charles Goerens?
Well, what we have to do first of all is to improve dignity of people and all people, dignity of all people. And we must acknowledge that we are living in a world largely impacted, conditioned by globalization, which means that the difference between nations is decreasing. Meanwhile, inside the countries, the inconsistencies and imbalances are increasing. And that's a common challenge for all of us. In countries, industrialized countries or emerging countries, there are sufficient means generated by the economy allowing them to overcome this kind of imbalances and inconsistencies. That's the reason that we have to ask them to be responsible for their own development. Yesterday or a few years ago, this was part of international solidarity. Now it has become domestic policy. And towards the developing world, we have the developing countries, the least developed countries, first of all, we have to act as partners in order to allow them to integrate themselves in our common networks, in cultural networks, in economic networks, and so on, and to allow them to exist also on a political level.
Victor Negrescu?
I believe our goal is to save lives and to make people participate, both from the recipient country but also for European citizens. And the risks, in my opinion, are too much bureaucracy and the dangers represented by populism and nationalism that is influencing a lot of policy making in Europe in the last years.
Thank you very much. It's all for today. I would like to thank our guests, Dorota Bessa, Seamus Jefferson, Mr. Charles Goerens, Victor Negrescu, and Andris Gobins, our students, Irene Benedicto and Justyna Czyczyńska. Thank you very much.